Pasar a darle la palabra al invitado Alessandro Ludovico.
Thank you very much, and I have to thank you so much, starting to thank you so much, Ignacio, Mario, Valentina, and Universidad Andrés Bello, and all the people who worked a lot for us to bring me here. It's such an honor for me to be here today, and something that, especially with Ignacio, we have worked for quite a few years to make it happen. So I'm very, very glad to have the opportunity to share with you what I've done in the last 2 decades, actually. So to quickly introduce what I do. I'm the editor-in-chief of this magazine. I will quickly show it to you in a minute. This is the website. It's called Mural, and it's a new media art magazine that started in 1993. Let me proudly show it to you, the first cover. So in November, this is the first issue. In November we will celebrate 20 years of publishing. Mural has always been a printed magazine. So I've always been very passionate about traditional printing, but talking about, or better, being very involved in net art and new media art more in general. I always been mixing the traditional publishing with, of course, the latest technologies. So in a way, always being in the middle between these two things, traditional and digital publishing. Mural has always been, it was not the only magazine, it was not the first magazine about new media art. Maybe it's one of the oldest one, still going on if you want, but there are 2 concepts of Mural which I really care of. One is that for me Mural has always been a magazine of ideas. So more than interviewing, for example, artists about what kind of technology they use or what kind of projects they want to do, I always tried to talk about what kind of ideas they have, what kind of strategies they apply through technologies, through digital meanings, so through creative processes and so on. And Mural has always been a magazine to be meant to be very critical about technologies in order to exploit them as much as possible, but to enable cultural and social processes especially. Okay, another concept which I really care about Mural in general is that I never thought about the magazine as that it should have been the best magazine of old magazines talking about creative technology, so to say, nor the only one, the opposite. I always, one concept that I've always cared a lot about is the network concept. So I always thought that Mural should have been a node in a network. In fact, I started quite early to network with other magazines, independent magazines, with the same content. That's why after almost 10 years from Mural, in 2002 I had this great opportunity to spend 1 week in Sevilla with another 11 editors from all over Europe and Fran Ilich from Mexico, where we founded a network of magazines, which we called Magnet, Magazine Network of Electronic Cultural Publishers. What this network was about. In 10 years we have produced something, I will show it to you in a minute, but mainly it was about mutual support. So despite the fact that we, in a way, can compete for some niche of readers, we wanted to support each other. So what we did periodically was to gather all together and to share the knowledge we have acquired. So to be very practical, for example, the knowledge about how to use electronic payment in order to sell our subscriptions, or how to use print on demand. Each of us who acquired a certain amount of knowledge about a specific field was sharing it during the next meeting. Our slogan was and still is, collaboration is better than competition. What we also have produced with Magnet is 3 readers, 3 printed readers, which are completely free to download, and those 3 readers are about, again, the relationship between digital and traditional publishing, which we as magazine publishers experience almost every day in our work, so from a practical level. But as you can hint, I'm very passionate about this topic, and I've been since the beginning. Actually, Neural is born after another small publishing initiative about virtual reality when I started to work on these topics. This relationship, then I tried to push it as much as possible. And I've made a research at the Willem Koning Academy in the Netherlands for 6 months, which led me to work for 3 years on this book, which is called Post-Digital Print. The mutation of publishing since 1894. Maybe we can make them circulate a bit to have a look. I will talk about one specific chapter of this book later. Let me just say that maybe shamelessly I dedicated the last issue of Neural as an addendum to this research, to what was left from the research itself. I would only like to introduce you to another couple of works I'm involved into, and then I will talk to you about the second chapter, specifically the second chapter of this book. One thing I'm currently involved is that I'm curating a virtual space in Jeu de Paume, which is a French museum in Paris, and they have a virtual exhibition space on their website, and they accepted my idea to work with artists who work again with this relationship. They work with the relationship between digital and traditional publishing. So we were able also to commission some artworks, some virtual artworks. Most of them are really, most of those artworks are analyzing how intertwined and how quite interesting and challenging is the relationship now from many respects, from what it means for copyright to what it means to the transmission, the distribution of information, and how those two aspects, the printed page and the digital page, can start to really mix in a quite interesting way. One thing which I want to, the last thing I want to talk about quite quickly, there's one important note that the book, unfortunately, I have only that one copy with me, but the book is published under Creative Commons and can be freely downloaded from this specific web address. For free, it can be downloaded and shared, or better, it's really encouraged to download and share it. The last project I want to mention before engaging with this chapter about the history of alternative publishing I'm going to talk to you in a while is the Neural Archive. Okay, it will take me more or less 5 minutes to explain what it is about, but it's a project I really care, and I'm working on it since years. What it is about. I started with the concept that as a magazine we received a lot of publications, especially books, magazines, catalogs in 20 years. So there's this kind of private archive. Neura is a no-profit organization, it's a legal format, and this collection, which is a quite nice collection, and I would say also a little bit historical collection of publications, was just invisible because it was just in our rooms, and I thought it would have been very important at least to share the presence, the notion of all those publications. What we started to do then is to make a catalog, an online catalog of everything we received. So this is actually there are 500 publications, 568, but it's an ongoing work. We have almost 2,000, and it's very focused on the three themes of the magazine, which are new media art, sound art, and hacktivism. So this is what is already in the catalog, but what's the purpose of this catalog? For us is to sharing again the knowledge of some texts, which not all the time are quite easy to know about or to get, and to make those fundamental data, the cover, author, publisher, country, language, publication year, bibliographical data, and the index searchable. So it's meant to be a small free resource for everybody. But there's even more ambitious concept behind it. One is that, the main one is that we have public libraries, which are a great resource, but they are formalized as institutions, so in a quite hierarchical way. We should, of course, preserve as much as possible public libraries, but when it comes to some specific knowledge, like it's new media art, for example, so it's hard to get a lot of referential text about this kind of topics. So private or small collections made by small institutions and like Neura or private people should be public in order to have a kind of complement to the public libraries. I try to imagine this as a so-called peer-to-peer library, or as I try to call it, distributed archives. They in a way complement what the main libraries have, and in an even more nice way, those catalogs could be easy to make and easy to be shared among fellow, let's say, collectors. So this specific platform has been developed all in free software and with the most basic technologies. And I commissioned it, but of course it's completely free to use now. More than that, it will be open data in a few months, so it will also be portable. And the main idea is that other institutions, I've already started to talk with Alta Tecnologia Andina in Peru, could use the same platform or could make it compatible, and we can have a single index, a kind of small search engine, which would search 2 catalogs. And if we can have 10 or let's say 100 catalogs, they can be searched all at once, finally making those kind of resources easily searchable and publicly available, so to say. There's another important thing, which is that when you publish a catalog of what you have, in a way you are taking public responsibility about that. You are saying, I have this collection and I'm taking care of that. And in this way, you take public responsibility within a small community. Which means that if one day you will change your mind and you want to give up this role, then somebody else in the community could take over. And this is meant to be good for the preservation of these kind of resources. Okay, I just have to make a little note, which is that I asked for printed stuff during my tour, actually during the last 20 days in Latin America, but I totally underestimated the generosity of people, so now I'm ending up with too much stuff which I can't carry myself, but I still have even more generosity shown in sending the whole amount of stuff which has been donated to the New Archive by those people who brought me here. Okay, this is the outline. I want to quickly introduce you to the second chapter of the book. The first chapter is about the death of print, when in history the death of print has been announced and never happened. I found 8 cases when it was announced. The first one in 1894, as I mentioned. The second chapter is a history of alternative publishing, reflecting the evolution of print. And I will start with this sentence, which is that, at least for me, print is a liberating technology. It's liberating in the sense that it gives you, it lets you express. It gives you room for expression. You can really print, when you print content, you have this content to circulate and to be easily preserved for quite a long time. Actually, I like also the chapter starts with this sentence from Andrés Bello, the very famous surrealist, saying, "One published to find comrades." So the printed act, the publishing gesture, is made not for, as most of the time, not and historically not as a self-gratification gesture, but as a gesture which lets ideas circulate, and easily it lets you find fellow people with which you can share ideas and with which you start to collaborate and develop new ideas. Fostering ideas is, of course, the main question of printing. Okay, to date back the history of alternative print, I've found something which is even before Gutenberg, so before 1494, the year when Gutenberg printed the first Bible. Before that, there were printing, of course, through the carving of wood, and I found this Biblia Pauperum, which were single sheets explaining most of the New Testament, but in a specific way. They were explained, we could say, I don't know if you can get it, they are structured mostly as comic. So they were single sheets which were given away for free, like single sheet newspapers, but not as newspapers, but they were meant for religious purposes. But making it as, making the message, which is a religious message, very simple and accessible to everyone. And they were printed independently, of course, from the church. But we have an even more significant effort, which is from the 17th century. There was this group at the outskirts of London, which was a very radical group called the Ranters. The Ranters were a kind of, today we could say, an anarchist collective. Again, you have to think 17th century. And what the Ranters, they have quite a heretical position, about religion. They thought that Jesus is in everyone, so who needs the church? About politics, they wanted expropriation of the rich and collective ownership of property. and they had also quite radical position about sex. They just believed in free love. Free love was absolutely the principle. And they printed quite a few books about that. Or better, not books but magazines in the end, kind of reviews. Of course they were prosecuted, most of them they were killed, and again you have to think 17th century. And many of the publications were burned. But when you print stuff in thousands of copies, some of them have survived and we can still have them. Again, this is a case of alternative underground publishing from the 17th century, which was circulated and printed in a totally autonomous, we would say almost do-it-yourself way today. And we have another great example, which is the Thomas Paine, which in a way culturally prepared the American Revolution. He was a pamphleteer, and this common sense, his work was printed with his own money, a bit of money, teaming up with the printer in the 18th century. And after the first run, it was such a great success that the printer started to print it himself. But again, it was printed in tens of thousands of copies. Again, another do-it-yourself publications which it was quite understanding. And we should not forget that different important literary authors self-printed their work. William Blake, the very famous British poet, was one of them. This is one of his own editions where he also made his drawings. Okay, time-wise, we are then close to the 20th century avant-garde and their use of print, which is quite remarkable. The first one, which used print was of course the Futurism. This is Poesia, which is the first futurist magazine. Magazines for avant-gardes were clearly important to fostering their new ideas, which clearly broke up with the past. But Poesia, which was founded by Marinetti, Marinetti was not such a calm guy. He was very active and easily fighting with his fellow futurists. He at some point wanted to broke up with the publisher of Poesia and went to Florence, where he started a new magazine called La Cerba, which already started to rethink typography. As you can see, the title is quite weird, in very big letters, and the use of lines to break up the whole page started to was one of the experiments that then he pushed to the extreme limits in his famous visual poet works called Parole in Libertà. It's also worth to mention, it was a new kind of typography, of course. It's also worth to mention that the last printed effort of Marinetti and of Futurism in general was this newspaper called L'Italia Futurista. Unfortunately here Marinetti has already sold his soul to the fascism. But here you have a quite interesting use of printed magazine, in this case of printed newspaper, because on L'Italia Futurista you find the only photographic documentation of futuristic theater performances. So, again, the vehiculation of ideas and in this case of documentation is incorporated in the printed page by these different magazines. Then, of course, we have Dada, and the Dadaists had a different approach. They were publishing the same magazine, which was called Dada, in different cities, where different groups were. So every group was autonomous and was allowed to use Dada as the name of the magazine. It's interesting that there was, again, no money to print them. So what the Dadaists were doing were to negotiate with the printer how to make it, how to start to print a few copies. Sometimes in some cities you have to, of course you have to consider that Dada was spread in quite a few cities all around the world: Zurich, Berlin, Cologne, Amsterdam, Paris. New York and Tbilisi had a Dada issue, at least one. And here again, you have an independent effort which was meant to be built with finding an alliance, so to say, with the printer. And the same concept of the printed page started to change with avant-garde, especially in the 20s and 30s. We have this concept by Lisinski of the book, not anymore as a mere content of printed of the printed page, but the book as a unity of acoustics and space, what a printed page can eventually generate. Okay, we have to mention also that Lisinski had this vision of going beyond the printed page finally, and having access to his whole library through electric technology, which was the main revolution during the first decade of the 20th century. So at some point in his text, Topography or Typography, he started to think, he defined what it could be in the future, the electro library. Then we have the Mimeograph, which is a huge revolution in underground, in alternative print. The Mimeograph has been conceived by Thomas Edison very early in 1876, and this is actually the machine. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Mimeograph. It's quite an old machine, but its concept is quite simple. You have a matrix, an original, and you print it many times. It's very dirty. You get full of black stains because of the ink. But it was very important because it was very cheap, and you could make lots of prints. Even more important is the fact that it was a printer, but relatively small, and you could move it from one place to the other, and even more important, you could conceal it, you could hide it. So it becomes important for perfect concealed printer. It becomes important for two different reasons on the two sides of the ocean. In USSR, the mimeograph is used by the opposition. The Bulletin Opposition by Trotsky has been printed on mimeographs. In his support against against Stalin, who was going to get the power. So they could print it in hidden places and distribute the whole content. You have a completely different use on the other side of the ocean, where that during the 50s, the mimeograph triggers the science fiction fanzines phenomenon. So science fiction passionate start to print their own fanzines in USA and start to trade and distribute them, and in order to share a different vision of the future. Same medium but different purposes, and especially in the 50s we have the phenomenon in the USSR of those how can I say, illegal publications, which are defined then as Shamista, often quoted. You can see here how quite rough they were. They were produced with typewriters, then collected and distributed. Again, the mimeograph played a quite important role in this kind of phenomenon. Then, going back to art movements, we have what Fluxus strategies did, and in the 60s, one decade later. for Fluxus, the printed medium is quite important. Also because Fluxus has two very outstanding compared to the classic art market strategies. One is to make artworks, series of artworks like the famous boxes by George Maciunas, which contained games printed on cards, together with small publications, together with other objects, and they are series, but for the first time they are produced but sold for cheap. They are not anymore, for Maciunas, they could be affordable by anyone. Art in this case and the folds contained by these art objects should have been affordable to anyone, so sold for very cheap prices like $20 or something. And the other important concept of Fluxus was the network. So they produced a newspaper, the Fluxus newspaper in various issues, and they started to rethink what can be done with the newspaper. Actually, what they did, for example, was to print the last page of the newspaper as a poster announcing a Fluxus concert, and then asking people to cut it and to use it, so to attach it to walls, transforming every reader in an active person using some content of the newspaper itself. Another issue of the newspaper was made as an artwork, was meant to be cut in pieces and then assembled as a game. Again, rethinking the format. But as I was saying, for Fluxus, it's very important the concept of network. Fluxus started what is the mail order flux shop. So having material in different cities and in different areas, which could be ordered and accessed and shipped and exchanged. And this leads to another small revolution. For Fluxus, this is called the eternal network. Sorry. After the 60s, we have the 70s, with what was the underground press boom. In the 70s, with all the new folds after the 68 movement especially, we have a huge production of printed material in various ways. One of them, maybe one of the most symbolic publications, is The Oracle in San Francisco, which is a very colored magazine. But how that colors were produced, actually. It was a new way of printing, led mainly by the editors themselves. What they did actually was to go to the printer and negotiate with the printer what they wanted, how they wanted it to be printed. And at some point, it was so complicated for the printer that the printer said, okay, I don't want to deal with you. This is the machine, let's do what you want. And they started to drip colors in almost a random way during the printing process. So you have magazines which are quite different. It's the same magazine, it's quite different, one issue from the other. And we can also say that it plays a visual role in the culture, in the hippie culture in San Francisco during the 70s. The Oracle giving a visual frame to the ideas which were spread at that moment. We have to say that Oracle was quite important. It reached the amount of 150,000 copies during the 70s. It was quite influential. But visually, again, you have the magazine which becomes also an object because of how it is structured, and an object to look at, and in a way for the Oracle in itself a trip. But again, the concept of network is recurring. This is another magazine produced in the same period called Other Seeds. And it was made by an editor who was traveling around the world. His concept was to make a magazine where it was. not considering all the problems of printing a magazine where actually it was. So it's a kind of so-called travelogue, a diary of the specific city is, but it's printed in every time in a different city, reflecting not only his experience, but also the printing possibilities of that specific city, and from there, shipped around the world. There's another very important phenomenon in the 70s, which is the underground press syndicate. Actually, the underground press syndicate was a syndicate. Was reuniting 150 underground publications. What they were doing was just to share their content. So imagine one fanzine. Imagine the Oracle. The Oracle was part of it. All the content published by the Oracle was given to the syndicate, and every other small magazine in part of the syndicate could use it without asking permission. And it was the same for the other content.
Where? Where was that?
It was based in the United States. Yeah. It was including also alternative press agencies which were producing content which was as well incorporated in the underground magazines. So at some point we had this kind of pool of content which was used in different ways by the magazine. But it was also, and that's quite interesting, available for commercial publications, but they had to pay. So they were sharing their content among themselves on an underground level, and they were able to get a bit of money from the commercial side, having them to pay. Quite, if you want, groundbreaking concept for the 70s in underground publishing. Okay, then we have another very important magazine at the end of the 60s, which is the whole art catalog. Another concept again. The other concept was to having a magazine about tools. So a magazine that would be extremely useful, would host tools for empowering yourself in order to make your life as you want it, to liberate yourself, I mean, to give yourself the chance to develop your environment, your ideas in any way you like. This was made collecting addresses, tools, a lot of interesting and important information, but strictly useful, together with text, in a single publication. The founder, I have to make a reference, which is quite important, because the founder of Whole Art Catalog, a controversial person called Stuart Brand, indeed a founder of one of the very first BBSs in the world, which was The Well in the Bay Area in San Francisco. In the last issue of the Whole Art Catalog, said the famous phrase, the famous sentence, "Stay hungry, stay foolish." So I'm sorry to say it's not at all by Steve Jobs, as the media pushed it a few years ago. Steve Jobs mentioned it during a talk at the Chicago University, but he was quoting Stuart Brand, just to be clear and to give Stuart Brand what he thought about. We have two more quite substantial revolutions in underground press. The first one is the Xerox, the photocopy, during the last 70s. Actually, this is the first one, the first model of a photocopier made by Xerox. And it's from the 50s, but it was really introduced then in the 70s, and it triggered all the publications of the punk movement. Actually, in this case, we have two important characteristics. One is that the punk movement absorbed, or better used, the aesthetics of the photocopier with strong contrast, and also started to incorporate another two important things. Mixing the media in order to have photographs with high contrast, but mixing also written content with typewritten content, but even more important than the rest, with punk scenes we have for the first time in underground press an extensive view of copy and paste. Punk scenes were appropriating culture from visually from the whole pop world and using it, determining them or in a way rethinking them in quite a substantial way. Then there's another vision in the same years, end of 70s, which is using the postal system as a network. You see, network concept recurring again. The postal system is an incredible infrastructure if you think about it. It's the first global network which is physical. Since after the Second World War, there are agreements between all the postal systems around the world. So you can ship something physical from any part of the world to any other part of the world. And that was used by a specific art movement called mail art, which is still quite underestimated in art history, but I think it's quite important. It's very important. The mail art used the postal system to ship artworks. The concept was we can make an international exhibition without having any infrastructure. Everybody should send their artworks. We don't need critics, we don't need, everybody can be an artist, and we only need a public space to make this exhibition. And then we will make some catalogs, maybe just photocopied, and we'll send them back to all the artists. That's how we want to make art. They of course produced also a magazine, the New York Correspondence School magazine, made by one of the founders of the Mail Art Network. But there's another concept which is quite interesting by mail art, and is the assemblings. The assemblings are, the concept was asking for, let's say, 100 copies of artwork. So I'm making an assembling, and I'm asking artists to send 100 copies. When I get all the copies from all the artists, I make 100 catalogs with one copy of the work in each catalog. I'm assembling all the artworks, producing actually the catalog. You see, you have then 100 originals, which are then sent back to the artist. It's a kind of collective way to make artworks which is reflecting the artist and the structure itself in a completely independent way. So each copy was, of course, a personalized one. Then, in the same years, we have also another use of print, which is the fakes. This is an Italian group called Imale, who made fakes. Fakes, a fake newspaper, quite satirical about some strategic political aspects. This is a fake first page of the made in Poland, and it says that the Central Committee Secretary of Poland, of the Communist Party in Poland, was resigning, and the Pope Karol Wojtyła was stepping in on the, with the crown of King of Poland. This was distributed during the visiting of John Paul II in Poland in the very beginning, and of course you can imagine the reaction of people because it was very carefully made as an original Tribuna Ludu copy. Fake is also a recurring theme in underground press. Talking about technologies, we have also the faxes. Here is the very important aspect is that the strategical aspect is that you have a zine produced and sent in real time and at home. This is the other characteristic which is crucial. Starting to think that if you have a machine, you can have content delivered straight to your house. But of course the main revolution, what we are talking about, is the digital revolution.
that? The fax?
The faxines are contemporary to the fax machine, to the lowering of prices of fax machine. So we can date them mostly between the end of 70s and the beginning of the 90s. That's the period that we can mostly date them. There are not a lot, there are quite a few, and there are of course a substantial problem of preserving them, because when they are exposed to light they tend just to vanish, so it's also an imperial medium. But in the middle 80s we have the biggest revolution we are facing, which is the digital one. How to produce printed press through the dematerialization of the production. So we have the first so-called desktop publishing systems. Actually, this is not really underground. This is the first Apple model, and it was very expensive at that time. But as the photocopy machine in the end of 80s, we start to have excuse me. We start to have copy shops who have these machines. So you can compose your own magazine with a computer and then go there in order to print it, and then photocopying it for a quite substantial number of pages and issues. This triggers a lot of new press, both amatorial and quite professional. This leads also to different type of things triggered by the digital medium. One is the CD-ROM magazines. I hope you are still quite familiar with CD-ROMs. It's kind of DVD, but with much less capacity. This is, for example, a commercial CD-ROM magazine which was produced in the 90s about music. And we also have multiple media. This is a Japanese magazine which was made in a box. And it was containing a printed magazine, a CD-ROM with data, an audio CD, a CD-ROM with software, another few printed small booklets, and even a t-shirt. So having a whole range of media. I have to say there's another experiment in the 70s called Aspen magazine, which is similar, but they didn't have CD-ROMs. They have a Super 8, pellicula, and other kind of stuff. And we have an explosion of magazines between the 80s and the 90s, which is very symbolized by Fact Sheet 5. Fact Sheet 5 was a magazine about magazines. For every issue, Fact Sheet 5 was reviewing 1,000 independent publications. 1,000 different publications, all categorized. But at some point, when the web more or less arrives, this whole printed publication boom triggered by digital collapse. And the purely digital qualities start to take the stage, so to say. So in 1995, John Markov, a journalist from New York Times, published on the cover this quite interesting sentence, that anyone with a modem, today we would say with a router, is a potentially global pamphleteer. We start to experience the purely digital perspective. And we have another interesting experiment by a writer, William Gibson. William Gibson, I don't know if you are familiar with him, is a writer, I think it's very skilled, but before becoming kind of, not mainstream, but established writer in the literary market, he used to be a writer of science fiction, and he started what was called the cyberpunk, the science fiction literature. He produced a very interesting experiment, which he called Agrippa. It was a very expensive, limited edition work, and he made it on a floppy disk. Again, I don't know how many of you, especially younger, are familiar with floppy disk, but you can think as a kind of an old version of USB keys, so to be clear. So he made it on a floppy disk, but with a very specific characteristic. It was a poem, and you can turn pages. This was the cover, this was one of the pages. Clicking, you turn the page. But when you turn the page, the content of that page was physically erased on the medium, on the floppy disk. So it was gone. You couldn't read it again. You couldn't go back. So basically, when you finish reading it, the whole very expensive book was gone. This was very symbolic in 1994 about the fragility of the digital medium in publishing, which is still very true today. Actually, in the first issue of Mir, we published the text because we were contacted by a hacker, a US hacker, who made a very simple hack. He had a copy, he didn't buy it, but he had a copy on a floppy disk, and he filled the whole text while turning the pages, and then he transcribed the whole text. And he wanted to send it to us. We translated it into Italian, and we published it on the very first issue of Miro, which for us was quite symbolic. Oh, okay, I'm close to finishing. I'm just want to make a couple of examples now. And especially the role of print. Which is the role of print now? It's quite complex. I've dedicated another 2 chapters of the book discussing it. But the trust of print is intact. We have a few centuries. Of familiarity with print, which made print, as it has been defined, the killer interface, the printed page. But at the same time, the print is meant to stay for a long time, but its speed, it's becoming too slow. When I got this magazine this morning, but of course it's printing the news of yesterday. That's something which has happened in between. Just for making an example, there's no news about the small earthquake which we all experienced last night. So its speed is becoming slow. But the most interesting part for me is that what should be the role of print compared to the role of digital. And the role of print could be interesting if it starts to embody the processes that digital can enable. So, here we are. One of the most interesting artworks in this sense is the so-called, how they called it, New York Times Special Edition by the art group called Yes Men in 2008. What they did was to print a fake copy of the New York Times, but perfectly, literally perfectly done. They spent months scanning and reproducing digitally the logo, every single detail. Then, with anonymous sponsoring, because it took quite a bit of money, they were printing the real thing. So, a real New York Times, but fake in its content. Perfectly plausible. What about that? The main idea was to publish plausible news, like the end of hierarchy war, and distribute it for free in New York through almost 100 different volunteers. People were in the early morning, so the effect as the fake of the Time group in the 70s was quite astonishing. People were kind of incredibly happy and also celebrating, but they didn't notice one detail, that the date was 1 year after. So it was 4th of July, it was distributed on 4th of July, of course, as a symbolic gesture, on 2009. It was conceptually incorporating all the hopes that the Obama election was triggering. But this should let us reflect a little bit about the role of print, of the role of media today, as we experience news on the web, which most of the time are almost not yet happened. So they are mostly triggering our imaginary more than reporting what has already happened. So in this case, there was a kind of collection of the whole, so of the public imaginary, as it would have happened, but not ethereal in a digital form, but as a printed one, so people could have remembered in the next days something about their imaginary and their hopes. Okay, in this sense, digital most of the time is announcing more than narrating reality. And fake could be a very clever and interesting strategy to play with the printed medium. This is a sentence from a 70s zine published by the Italian philosopher Franco Bifo Berardi. The zine was called Attraverso, was the most important zine of the so-called creative autonomy in the 1977 movement. And the subtitle of this very visionary zine was "False Information Can Produce Real Events." So in the end, the intertwining of digital and print still gives room to a lot of interesting experiments. Thank you very much.